Hi, good morning, everyone. So today we are transitioning to our final unit of H9, which is the rise of totalitarian governments. Sometimes this is also referred to as the interwar period because it's the handful of years that's between World War I and World War II. So we're not getting into World War II because that is where you're going to start off in H10. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Sorry, I have a couple of monitors, so I want to make sure I'm at the right one. Now, just a reminder, you are going to be submitting your notes. But if you would prefer, you can take it on the note taker that I provided, or you can also do it on a separate sheet of paper. It's totally up to you. So let's go ahead and talk about the world after World War I. Europe is in a really rough place following World War I. Their resources are completely drained. So even though Europe was the continent that was the leader, the strongest, if you will, in the world after World War I, that title of the most powerful and strongest continent in the world is starting to decline. That's first off because they have massive casualties following World War I. They lose millions of their citizens, young, able-bodied men that were supposed to push forth new governments and new economies, unfortunately have passed away or are scarred mentally or physically from the war. Most countries are bankrupt. Fighting a war for years means that people aren't going to go out and buy goods and services. And then lastly, again, as I mentioned, their global influence is starting to shrink as well. The United States and Japan are the only two nations that actually have a strengthened economy following World War I. And one of the reasons for this is the fact that no battles are actually fought in the United States or in Japan. So this is somewhat of a positive because they're able to continue their production without getting factories and roads bombed. To make matters worse for this time period, towards the end of World War I and the end of World War I, we see what is known as the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919. It's sometimes also referred to as the Spanish flu, even though it did not originate out of Spain. So this might be hitting a little too home right now, considering I'm literally recording a lecture into an empty classroom because currently in the year 2020, we are also in a pandemic. Anyways, unfortunately, the influenza pandemic of 1918 was extremely deadly. It actually killed more people than World War I did. It's estimated to have killed 50 million people, comparing that to the 38 million that died because of World War I. And the influenza pandemic of 1918 had about a 20% mortality rate. And 20 to 40% of the world's population becomes infected by this pandemic. Now, before you start freaking out about the number 50 million, I want to remind you that the current pandemic that we're in is being treated very differently than the pandemic of 1918, as well as the fact that our technology and our medical resources are far greater than what we had 100 years ago. So just a reminder in case you're getting a little bit panicky about this. We start to see things like maybe we would see today, covering your mouth when you sneeze or cough, right? Use the handkerchief and do your part to protect me, right? So you hear people talking about like coughing in your sleeve nowadays or sneezing in your sleeve. We start to see public service announcements. Go home to bed if you are not well. Stay home. Maybe this is hitting home. We also start to see people wearing masks out in public. And one of the reasons why the pandemic doesn't last very long, right, 1918 to 1919, is because there aren't actually many precautions that are taken. So whereas right now in our current state, we're trying to lower and slow down the progression of COVID-19, that doesn't really happen on a large scale during the Spanish flu. And instead, we just see a huge spike in people getting sick. And unfortunately, hospitals and staff are unable to take care of all of these sick patients. If you're interested in learning more about the Spanish flu, there's a podcast called Stuff You Missed in History Class, and they have a really good, thorough 25-minute podcast about the Spanish flu, as well as there's a bunch of videos on YouTube that explain it. You might hear people on the media compare what's currently going on with COVID-19 to the Spanish flu as well, the similarities and the differences. And so the reason why this is especially heartbreaking for this time period is that the war is over, yet millions of people continue to die. The young, the old, the sick, everyone. Unlike COVID-19, which primarily focuses or affects, the elderly when it comes to mortality rate, the Spanish flu actually killed a lot of 20-year-olds, people that were supposed to be picture perfect healthy. And so imagine surviving the battlefields of World War I only to come home and find that the flu is better at killing people than the war, that you are greeted with a general paranoia about human contact. How does this make you feel about the state of the world? I really want you to try and put yourself in the shoes of a soldier who's just experienced such trauma only to come home and find out that restaurants, movie theaters are closed, schools have closed down, neighborhoods are completely quarantined. And unfortunately, things don't necessarily get better for this generation. In Europe, new democracies start to form. From the years 1914 to 1918, absolute rulers are overthrown in Europe. Now, I'm not saying that all monarchies end, right? There are definitely still monarchies. I'm saying those absolute monarchies end. And so we see Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire all lose their absolute rulers and instead go towards new types of governments. However, these governments are extremely weak, and citizens have very little practice when it comes to understanding how to participate in a democracy, as well as what the purpose of a democracy is. These new governments formed that were already weak and fragile, but they had major issues to deal with, right? Post-war citizens, failing economies. And on top of that, all of these issues are met with no money. As I mentioned before, most countries are bankrupt following World War I. Another one of the big issues is that these new governments are filled and inundated with so many political parties that nothing gets done. And instead, you start to see what are known as coalition governments, which is when there are like compromises and groups of political parties that join in. However, because there's still not one massive party with a similar platform, they tend to break up rather quickly, and therefore nothing gets done in these new governments. And during such a tumultuous time, you want a government that's strong, that's able to help you with the Spanish flu, that's able to help a struggling economy, that's able to help citizens that have lost their job. And that's not what these governments are prepared and capable of doing. An example of this is the Weimar Republic, or the Weimar Republic, which is the new government that replaces the monarchy in Germany. However, it has very early issues. First off, Germans lack democratic traditions, so many Germans don't participate or understand what the purpose is of a democracy. as I said before, Germany is a prime example of a place with too many political parties and too much bickering to actually get anything done. And then lastly is the fact that the Weimar Republic is blamed for the loss of World War I. Even though they don't start the war, the Weimar Republic is the one that signs the Treaty of Versailles. And I cannot stress enough how much German citizens detest the Treaty of Versailles. To make matters worse for the Weimar Republic is they hit massive inflation. So the German government during World War I, instead of increasing taxes, instead what they do is they just print more and more money, which is a terrible way to make money. And this leads to what is known as inflation, which is when the value of money decreases. And following the war, rather than this new government fixing what the old previous government did, they actually continue the policy of printing more money to pay back their war debts. Again, the problem is that their money becomes useless. That's right. And what we end up seeing is people with fixed incomes, meaning like you make $20,000 a year. It's fixed. You're not making more. You're not making less. Well, their savings, their incomes becomes meaningless because $20,000 now can get you a cup of coffee for a year's long work, right? We see ridiculous things like that. In fact, the picture that you can see right here is a woman who's actually burning her money because it is more valuable as fire and heat than it is to actually go out and buy goods. So, of course, this inflation leads to greater distrust of their government because now people have money, but they actually can't buy anything with it. That would be like, for example, let's say right now in your bank account, you have $100 saved. You've been working the last year saving $100 and you can't wait because your parents said that once you save up to $100, you can buy that pair of shoes that you've really wanted to. And then in the matter of weeks, inflation increases and your $100 that you were hoping to buy these fancy shoes with is now enough to buy a cup of coffee. That year that you worked so tirelessly for is now kind of feels meaningless. And so there are attempts to try and fix this economic instability because the world sees that this is a major problem for Germany and that they'll never be able to pay back their war reparations as outlined in the Treaty of Versailles if they continue to have massive debt and inflation. So one of the people that steps up and tries to figure this out is a man named Charles Dawes, who's an American banker, and he proposes the Dawes Plan, which is two parts. One, it gives a loan of $200 million to Germany to try and stabilize their inflation and their economy, as well as it creates a new schedule for war reparations of like how much and when Germany has to pay back the war reparations as outlined in the Treaty of Versailles. And this new schedule is a little bit more lenient and more reasonable for the struggling Germany. And it actually does work. By 1929, factories are producing like they were in pre-World War I conditions. So we do start to see Germany going from this major depression to kind of start to increase. And one other thing that I want to mention about the Dawes Plan is this chart over here. And in case you were thinking like, oh, this is so altruistic of the United States to do something like this, it is somewhat altruistic, but there is definitely a personal reason and a benefit for the United States to fund such a massive loan. So the United States would end up lending money to Germany to build up their economy. And in return, Germany would use that money as well as increase taxes to pay back France for the war reparations. And in return, France would pay back the loans that they took out from the United States, and therefore the United States would get their money back, right? So it's kind of this idea is that the United States is helping Germany pay back their loans because those loans ultimately are also to the United States through places like France and Britain. However, these good times that we see following the Dawes Act do not stay. And this is where we start to see the Great Depression. There are three major issues with the United States economy during this time period. One is an unequal distribution of wealth. Two, overproduction in factories and agriculture. And three, less of a demand for consumer goods. So factories start to produce a lot of goods because the factories in the United States are not just providing goods for the US, but also providing goods globally. So factories continue to bust out product after product after product. However, one of the things that's challenging because of the uneven distribution of wealth is that the people that are working in the factories actually cannot afford the goods that they're making. So here's the problem when companies don't pay their workers enough. If you don't pay your workers enough money, then those workers cannot ever become consumers and customers. So you might be working on a car or a fridge or a radio, building all of these new amazing products, but you yourself are never able to actually purchase them. And we start to, I keep saying start, and I'm really sorry, it's driving me crazy. Anyways, during this time period, a downward spiral continues. Because their employers are getting paid so little, there's less of a demand for goods. This less of a demand for goods means that less goods need to be made. This leads factories to cut down their production and therefore cut down their staff. So this leads to more people getting unemployed. And of course, if you're unemployed, that means that you demand less goods because you don't have as much money. And this spiral continues to go. A similar spiral is seen in agriculture as well. New technologies mean that farming is more profitable and more successful than ever. And while this is seen as an overall good thing, it does lead to overproduction. Farmers are producing more food than the population actually needs. And because farmers have huge amounts of grain or corn or whatever it is, and they know they can't sell it all, they drop down the price. And this leads to less profits for farmers. And one thing that you may not know about farming is that many farmers take out loans before their season starts. But because following their season, they didn't actually make as much money as they were hoping to, farmers are unable to pay back the loans that they issue to the banks. And without the loans that the banks were expected to get paid back, banks start to close. And when banks start to close, people who put their money in those banks lose all of their money. And that's it. The banks don't have to, if you lose your money during this time period because of a bank closure, there's no way to get it back. So all of these issues, right? Uneven distribution of wealth, less demand for goods, overproduction of goods and agriculture, eventually all culminate into an event known as the stock market crash. I know this is a lot, so let me kind of slow it down for you a little bit. Let me also make this smaller so you can see. So following World War I, as I mentioned before, the US economy is actually really strong. And this leads to people being really confident in US companies and the stock market. So people continue to buy stocks in the US stock market. But because the stock market has such a high demand, right? People keep buying it. The stock prices are increasing, right? Because companies are like, sweet, everybody wants stocks in my company. I'm going to make them higher and higher so that I can increase my profit. Middle-class Americans, though, start to see all these wealthy people buy stocks and they're like, excuse me, I want in on this awesome deal. However, middle-class Americans can't really afford stocks. So how they afford stocks is by buying on margin. And buying on margin is when you put a down payment on the stock and the rest of the money you borrow from a stock broker. This system works as long as your stock increases so that you can pay back your loan and make a profit. But I'm assuming you can see where I'm going with this. If your stock does not increase, then buying on margin leads to debt and leads to people being unable to actually pay for the stock that they purchased. And in 1929, the stock market becomes unnaturally high. Stock inflation is so high that people who research and study the stocks realize, something is iffy. So in 1929, people start to sell their stocks. They're like, stock markets can't just keep increasing infinitely. The stock market prices are going to start to drop. However, as people start to sell their stocks, it leads to this trickle of everyone trying to sell their stocks. And the reason why this is so problematic is because if everyone is selling their stocks, then no one is buying those stocks. So stocks that you may have bought for $100, you are now selling for $1, meaning you have lost $99. And in October 29th, 1929, 16 million stocks are sold. And this leads to the market collapsing. Because those stocks that were bought for thousands upon thousands of dollars are now being sold for pennies. And companies that once were really successful and had a lot of confidence have now completely dropped. And this leads to billions of dollars in paper wealth completely disappearing. People, on top of that, could not pay back the money that they had borrowed from buying on margin. So not only have you lost your stocks, your investments, but now you also owe massive amounts of money on stocks that are worthless. Companies, because of the stock market crash, are in debt and have no revenue really coming in from stock markets and start laying off workers. Prices start to increase on goods, but wages decrease. And remember, like I said, if you can't pay your workers enough to buy products and goods, then you're never going to have consumers. And that's kind of what we start to see. And by 1933, 1/4 of Americans are unemployed. And at its peak, the Great Depression leads to about 30% unemployment, which is massive. And all of this culminates into the Great Depression, which of course started in 1929, but goes up until, some historians still somewhat debate this, until about the start of World War II. So what I want you to do right now, I don't want you to do that. As I mentioned before, the United States economy following World War I is really holding up the rest of the world. And so you can imagine if a Great Depression hits the United States economy, how that's going to trickle out and affect other global economies. And that's exactly what happens. Because once 1929 hits, American bankers start demanding foreign loans be paid immediately. But these foreign countries don't really have the money. So they give off as much money as possible, but that leads to their own countries being even more bankrupt and even more in debt. On top of that, American investors withdraw their money from European companies and countries. And so companies in Europe that were hoping for United States bankers and investors to support their companies, well, now they have no money. And so companies start to fail in Europe. In response to all of this, the US government places high tariffs. Oh, that's traffic. Sorry. Tariffs on European goods because they want United States citizens, instead of buying a shirt from France, you should buy a shirt that's made in America. And the idea is that if you buy this shirt that's made in America, money's going to stay in the United States, and American companies will benefit. However, that's not what happens. This plan completely backfires because when high tariffs are placed on European goods, well, Europe does the same thing to us. So Europe puts high tariffs on US goods. And this actually leads to world trade dropping by 65%. And this is extremely problematic for the United States since most major companies in the United States were global companies. But now European nations, as well as South American nations, are not buying our goods, which of course leads to the companies being hit even harder. And then lastly, countries that were relying on the United States economy to get through their tough times, this includes South America and Europe, well, they're hit extra hard because the United States pulls out all of their money drastically from these countries, which leads to their banks failing, companies failing, and a depression that hits these nations almost overnight. And that's where we are following World War I. It's not a very uplifting time in American history or even global history. But it gets better is what I want to say, but the answer is no. It doesn't get better. This is a rough unit, you guys. What I would like you to do now, though, is in your own words, I want you to kind of describe what causes the Great Depression. You can start all the way from World War I and kind of describe the series of events. However, what I do not want you to do, I repeat, what I do not want you to do is tell me that the Great Depression was caused by the stock market crash. Okay? Because there are events that precipitate the stock market crash that are important to recognize. And then the last thing that you need to do today is you are going to take a 5 in 5 little mini quiz that is on Canvas, and this is going to go into your content gradebook. That is all I have for you today. Have an amazing day, you guys. Happy Monday, and I'll see you all later. Email me if you have any questions.